Once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Our next on our program is a high-level panel discussion titled Supporting Rspo on Identifying High Carbon Stock and Reducing Deforestation. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our respected panelists. First up, we have Mr. Grant Rosserman, the Global Forest Solution Coordinator for Greenpeace International. Dr. John Raisin, the Chief Research Scientist for the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. Dr. Faisal Parish, the Director of the Global Environment Center, and moderating this panel discussion is a man that needs no further introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Suzuki.
Thank you. I love this job because I don't have to say anything. So this is a very distinguished panel, and I've been delighted to meet them and to hear the expertise that they're going to provide. And I think it's really exciting to get a diverse approach to common problems. And so you'll get your chance to interject with questions at the end. But first we want to hear from them and what their various perspectives are. So let's introduce Grant Rosserman first, as he's a longtime activist, a forest campaigner, and the chair of the FSC. Are you still chair of the FSC? Not anymore. He was on the FSC International Board and Global Forest Solutions Coordinator for Greenpeace International. And he's going to talk about practical approaches to implementing policies that will lead to no deforestation.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And it's certainly a very hard act to follow, following on from David and his very inspiring talk we've just heard. And David certainly set the scene for what we want to talk about in terms of a critical issue in relation to air, water, soil, food, biodiversity, the issue of deforestation, and not a new one, but what I want to talk about is an approach that we have been developing over the last years to address deforestation in a very practical way. We call it the high carbon stock approach. So the context, just in terms of the contents, it's the context first of the HCS approach, how it came about with no deforestation. We have, what is the HCS approach? A quick overview of that. I can't go into too much detail of that, but I can run it through. What's the relationship to what we call the SPOM HCS study, which John will talk about, but this is one of the issues we want to discuss as well, and also the next steps in going forward. So certainly the HCS approach developed to implement no deforestation policy commitments that break the link between palm oil and deforestation. So the methodology was initially developed by Golden Agri Resources, GAR, the Forest Trust, and Greenpeace over the last 3.5 years. More recently, there's a multi-stakeholder HCS approach steering group that's been established to provide the global governance and standardisation for this approach. So we've taken it out just from the original 3 organisations to a much broader group now. And this steering group has a consultative forum that we're seeking broader stakeholder engagement, including from consumer companies, from civil society organisations, communities, and of course all Rspo and other organisations. The HCS steering group also proposes to engage with governments. Governments need to be key partners in delivering no deforestation in the implementation of the HCS approach. Also, there is an initiative called the Palm Oil Innovation Group, which includes the high carbon stock approach in its charter and is carrying out independent verification of no deforestation via the HCS approach. And the HCS approach steering group and the POIG both aim to have the HCS approach incorporated into the Rspo, PNC, and including in other initiatives such as FSC or RED Plus or any other initiatives that are relevant. So what is the HCS approach? Some of you may know. I'll go through it very quickly. It's a tool for land use planning. It's not a carbon assessment, despite its name and how confusing that can be. It uses vegetation density and structure combined with the above ground carbon estimates, so at your plots, to identify forest areas from degraded lands, former forest. Then in a precautionary way, it combines this with biodiversity and the social considerations to pragmatically implement no deforestation in the humid tropics. So it is only for the humid tropics, this approach so far. It brings together HCS with HCV and with peatland and other aspects, other land layers, and also with free, prior and informed consent of communities and community mapping to complete the land use mapping recommendations. So there's two phases to the approach. Phase one is vegetation stratification to identify the potential high carbon stock forest areas, and the phase two is the HCS forest patch analysis leading to a conservation plan. So vegetation stratification. The first phase of this is using remote sensing, so it's a combined unsupervised and supervised analysis of satellite images to create 6 different vegetation strata. So relatively straightforward. Then we use field plots to actually assess a portion of the above ground carbon. So, and I emphasise this, we're not assessing all of the carbon, and it's only an estimate, and it's in the trees above 5 centimetres in diameter, above ground carbon. Of course, there has to be some engagement with the communities at this point. We cannot get on the ground to do the plots, so this is the beginning of the FPIC process that happens here, and including the mapping of their lands, because they have garden lands, that's not high carbon stock in the approach that we have. And then the biomass is converted, of course, into carbon through an allometric. The one we commonly use is brown from 1997, but there are more locally appropriate ones as well. So we end up with a stratification like this, with 6 different strata, and it does vary a bit around the world. We have been trialling it in different places in Africa and in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and so forth. So there is variations in this, but this is a stylised view, cross-section of the forest to show roughly the strata of how it works. HCS, high carbon stock forest, is on the left-hand side. Just to give you some quick images of what it's looking like. So this is the high-density forest. Includes carbon, primary forest as well, but you can see big trees, more or less closed canopy, but being logged over and disturbed in many cases as well. Medium-density forest is slightly smaller trees, more openness, more vine, and more canopy open. Low density, more heavily logged generally and disturbed, and smaller trees as we come down. And the final strata that is high carbon stock forest is the young regenerating forest, or in the Indonesian terminology, BT, with smaller trees, much more open canopy, but regenerating, and still some remnant forest areas that are there as well. And then the 2 degraded land strata, scrub, which has generally fairly recently been degraded or cleared, and the open land. So the phase 2, the second part of the approach, is looking at those patches of forest that have been identified from the remote sensing and from the field plot. So we do have a preliminary map of these potential areas. And the goal here is to identify viable forest patches that can maintain and revert to their ecological function as a forest. This is not about protecting every single tree, and in fact not even about protecting every little small patch of forest, because not all of these small disturbed pieces of forest will survive. So we want to focus on the big areas of forest that will survive and be ecologically functioning. It incorporates the general conservation and science principles of patch size, of shape, core area, configuration, connectivity, and so forth, and I'll run through those a little bit more. It takes account of some of the social aspects that there are in that area, community land use and rights. And it requires a robust high conservation value assessment and the participatory processes with the community to complete the land use planning. It doesn't work unless all of those things come together. So that's the final step, where those different layers, I guess, are integrated into a conservation plan, and that's the output that we end up with here. Just a little bit on some of these issues that we have to deal with forest patches. So we've been talking about the core. This is a key sort of concept with patches. So you can see the long skinny patch there, more or less no core, more or less all edge. This type of patch is unlikely to really survive. We believe, and the science tells us that. So we focus on the patches that have bigger cores and are more likely to sustain themselves. Then there's connectivity, so how close are patches to each other? Are there corridors connecting them? Are there stepping stones connecting them? We look at that, and this comes into particularly into the final sort of landscape level planning as well, because we want ecological viability, we want these ecosystems to function. The HCS patch analysis process is a little bit complicated. I don't want to run through the detail of it. We have a decision tree, and I'll show that in a minute. But it's just to run through the key steps. Firstly, from the community mapping, there'll be garden areas identified, maybe rubber plantations. We don't want to assess those. We take them out. They're not part of the high carbon stock forest areas, those community use areas, particularly for food. Then we now analyse the patch core areas and prioritise the large ones. There's the connectivity of the patches. We assess the risks to the patches in terms of how close are they to a road or to a settlement or to a river that's used for transport and so forth, because that has a bearing on how likely these patches will survive in the future. We review the presence of this Indonesian terminology, HK1, 2 and 3, so that's the higher density forest classes, because we believe even in some of these small patches where these older forest areas are, they have value probably particularly for biodiversity, and we want to check those. And we, in some situations, carry biodiversity assessments, rapid biodiversity assessments, to see if any of those values are still held in those small patches, and if they are, then they will also be brought back in and protected. There's ground checks, because you can sit in an office in a GIS system and have all the nice data you can have, but you need to go on the ground and actually see and check some of these things. So we do a ground check. And then there's the final overlaying and the integration process with HCV, with the peatlands and so forth, to come with a final conservation map that identifies the areas that should be for conservation and the areas that are potential for development. And there's a whole engagement process with communities in terms of the free, prior, informed consent and so forth that happens there. The decision tree, just to let you know that it exists, and this will be available soon. This is what's being used now by the companies that are implementing the HCS approach. Just, it's very complex. Some of the degraded landscapes we know of, so it's very difficult to identify which is HCS forest sometimes just we're looking at it. That's why we needed to develop this approach and this methodology. And just an example, this is one of the Golden Agri plantations in West Kalimantan, and the first one that we actually completed and did a lot of the trialling of the methodologies. So just to give you an idea of what an integrated conservation plan and the development area looks like as the final output. Just some comments now on the SPOM, the Sustainable Palm Oil Manifesto HCS study, which John will talk about, because there's been some interest in how does that relate to this approach that we've been working on. And so I think that one of the things that we've identified is that the HCS study of the SPOM focuses much more on greenhouse gas emissions and the socio-economic considerations, whereas we use basically simple carbon estimates of a portion of the above ground carbon, and it's a land use planning tool. So there's some differences there. We think it's a strength to have an HCS study that looks at different aspects that we haven't really been focusing on. When we started doing our work on the approach, we looked at soil carbon, and we thought it was just too difficult to deal with in the time period that we really had to come up with a practical approach. So we haven't done that, but I think John's really they're taking that on to have a look at the soil carbon. So I think we can learn from that, and we think that's fine for the study to be doing those other things, and then we can look at the recommendations that come from that. And the HCS approach steering group, which is now the broader governing body for the HCS approach, is open to any of the recommendations from that study, and we're looking for opportunities for collaboration on where we've got common ground. And the HCS approach and the steering group that we've developed, it's not just for palm oil, it is being used for the pulp and paper sector and for potentially for other sectors as well, so it's much broader than just palm oil. But I think we all have a shared goal of finding one accepted HCS methodology. We don't want confusing sets of methodologies in the future. At the moment, we're still in a phase of coming together, but I think that's our goal. So the next steps, quickly, the HCS approach steering group that I've mentioned, it's overseeing the standardisation. We're setting up working groups to deal with some of the very difficult issues that we're dealing with, including the HCS, HCV, FPIC integration. those methodologies already exist. How does HCS come together with those? Or even can we come up with a combined approach that has good synergies and benefits? We're establishing a science advisory committee to provide the science review and the science input that we need. There's a HCS approach toolkit that's in preparation that will be available in a short while that will really give all of the technical details that people need to apply the approach. And there's ongoing research, including the SPOM study and trials and field implementation that will provide feedback and recommendations to the approach. So it's an adaptive approach. It's being refined as we go, as we learn. This was new a few years ago. And particularly we're learning when it goes to different forest regions in different parts of the world. So we're really getting more information as we go. And the HES approach is being verified in the field via the Palm Oil Innovation Group. So we're learning about also how to verify it. And this is important, I think, if we have a goal of bringing it into the Rspo PNC, we want to know that this actually can be verified easily and transformed in that way. And I think one of the most challenging aspects is just looking at the mechanisms and the approaches for long-term conservation of HCS and HCV, in fact, because they do overlap. This is still in process, and certainly we heard yesterday how difficult it is also for, in the HCV to get the long-term conservation and even the legal protection as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grant. John Raisin is a soil scientist, and since 1976 he's been a research scientist at CSIRO. I know that CSIRO claims you're one of the Nobel Prize winners for the IPCC work. Anyway, he's a distinguished scientist who's going to talk about the focus on reliable emissions information for decisions. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody, and thanks to the organisers for providing this opportunity to speak. We're about to embark on a major study which will run for 12 months. It's well resourced and it's quite independent. And if you want to learn more about the details, you can look to the website shown here. I just have time in the next 10 minutes to speak briefly about the conceptual basis for our work, what the main outputs will be, and how they might be used. This is the three major outputs from our work that we're proposing. You'll see in a minute that our focus is clearly on greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon stocks are not really the issue, it's actually the change in carbon stocks that result in emissions. So our definition of high carbon stock forest will be in terms of emissions, and we will include biomass and below ground processes which often dominate the emissions signature. We'll also provide a practical method for identifying high carbon stocks on the ground. So that's a significant output. The second part is even more complex, and that is looking at how we might vary thresholds to take account of local socio-economic conditions, because we know that by varying the threshold we'll have a major impact on the amount of land available for development, and therefore a major impact on local socio-economics. So these conditions vary a lot in areas where new oil palm will be developed, so we'll try to explore that and come up with some recommendations there. The third critical point, I don't have a good screen in front of me, which is making my talk a little bit more difficult. I might just speak over the end. The third point is how do we actually look after the rights and livelihoods of local communities and Indigenous peoples when we're adopting a high carbon stock approach. Clearly, as I've said, there can be major implications for land available for development and all the consequent flow on. So this has to be a key issue, how high conservation value, high carbon stock and FPIC are integrated effectively. Here's the rationale as to why we're focusing on emissions in our work. This slide summarises the variation in carbon stock, both in biomass, the top part of the diagram, and in soil that occurs in tropical forests. But of course it's the loss of this carbon stock that's important. And for biomass it's a little bit more straightforward, because when the forest is cleared, most of the carbon in the biomass is emitted. For soil it's much more complicated, because although the pools of carbon are much greater in soil, not all of it is released upon disturbance. We've heard a lot of talk about peatlands, the right-hand side of that diagram. Clearly there are large emissions where there's drainage of peatland, but there's a lot of intermediate soils along that continuum, high organic soils, which again, if are drained, could have significant emissions. So we do need to try and grapple with the soil contribution to emissions as well as the biomass part. So as I said, there's a continuum of soil carbon stock, and in general the mineral soils are less vulnerable and the organic soils are much more vulnerable, but they can dominate emissions following conversion to oil palm and ongoing management. This is the diagram that Grant spoke to earlier. We are using a different approach. We don't subscribe to this approach for several reasons. Forests, there's a continuum of forests from high carbon to low carbon, but often this just reflects the state of disturbance of the forest. Yeah? So really this is just a point in time measurement, and over time what might now be a low carbon forest will move along that continuum and become a higher carbon forest. So that means it's very difficult to use this kind of concept to define what's a forest and what's not a forest, and to use it for avoiding deforestation. And this dynamics of the forest has to be taken account of, and the carbon gain associated with that regrowth, that needs to be considered in the greenhouse gas accounting as well. It's critical that when we look at the effects of a palm oil development, that we compare against a baseline, which is what would have happened without development. And the baseline is not always constant, and particularly the one we just looked at, the regrowth situation, there's actually a negative baseline, because that forest is regrowing and taking up carbon, and we need to take account of that. If we convert that forest, we essentially have sequestration foregone. And in the new crop, of course we count the carbon sequestered in the new palm growth, but we also have to be accounting for the sequestration foregone as a result of the conversion. And that's quite an important issue in the definition of what might be a high carbon stock. This slide tries to put our work in a sustainability context. What I've shown on the board there are the well-accepted sustainability criteria for forests. They're quite generic. They're organised sometimes in different ways in the different forest reporting and certification schemes. For example, in the Montreal process, the Forest Stewardship Council and the Rspo organise these in slightly different ways, but they're really all reflected there. And our study on high carbon stock or high emissions relates very much to what's in red. It's the contribution of forests to global carbon cycles. That's the primary objective of our work, is to address that criterion of forest sustainability. Not all the others. We have obviously some link into the green there, the maintenance of socio-economic benefits, because as I've said, by varying the threshold, we will have a major impact on development and and what happens to people. So that's where there's a little bit of difference between what Grant has said and what we're saying. We're not using carbon to go into biodiversity. We're saying we're focusing very much on the emissions part of forest sustainability. I just want to spend a few minutes on plans because this is critical, and everybody, I think, is agreeing that we need to address these issues through some kind of planning, but they're a hierarchy of plans. There are national level plans, regional level plans, and what we tend to focus on in these sort of discussions, concession or plantation estate level plans. And this is where the work, for example, of the Rspo new planting proposals fits in very much at that estate level. But the plans have to be linked and nested. So the national level plans typically reflect broad government policies. For example, there might be targets for greenhouse gas emissions, for maintenance of forest cover, for social development. And those national goals inform regional plans where regional context is taken into account, but the contribution of each of those regional plans can flow up to the national objectives. And below that then comes the concession level plans. And this is really about the design and management of plantation estates consistent with sustainability principles. Okay? And we contend that those kind of plans have many inputs, of which high carbon stock or emissions is only one. There are other inputs, critical inputs, such as other conservation values and the socio-economic factors that flow into those plans. So those plans become effectively a negotiation to deal with the sustainability issues that are identified by stakeholders. And as I've said earlier, changing the threshold for what we call high carbon stock will have a major impact on what might go into that planning exercise. So if our study is well done, it should be able to provide very useful information to guide that local level planning in terms of the greenhouse gas consequences of what we do and in terms of the socio-economic implications of applying differing acceptable levels of emissions. Of course, emissions come in at all those levels. They could come in at the national level, the regional level, as well as the estate level, but we tend to focus our attention more at the estate level because in the end, it's the aggregation of those plans and those on-ground management that flow up to the other scales. So just in summary, we think that HCS or high carbon stock or emissions associated with that are just one input into land use and management planning. High carbon stock, I think, for clarity and to do a thorough job, should focus on potential emissions resulting from land conversion and management. And in that context, HCS can be considered as another conservation value. It's the carbon or the greenhouse gas part of conservation, if you like. So together with HCV, we see HCS as a key input into the FPIC process, because FPIC really is about the key local negotiation where people who have rights to their land make decisions based on what will happen to it, how much will go to conservation, how much might go to development, what will be the consequences for the people, what will be the environmental implications and so on. So how that whole FPIC, HCV, HCS will actually play out, we don't seem to know. Nobody really seems to understand that very well at this stage, but that's something we'll certainly explore in our study. And the other thing to remember about planning is that there are many stakeholder inputs that come into play, particularly governments, and we're very aware of that in the work that we're doing. So I think there's lots of common ground here, as Grant has said. I think our broad intent is the same. We certainly support reducing deforestation, reducing or mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Common ground there. A lot of things that we're going to produce from our study will really help with the landscape planning approach they're doing. We can learn a lot from the practical experience of these guys. We're already doing that, so we will be looking to collaborate as much as we can there. So, look, I think it's all good, and I think Faisal will probably put another spin on it as well. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you, John. Faisal Parish is a wetland ecologist. He's the director of Global Environment Center since, 1999? Yeah. And he's going to talk about the Rspo approach to process and help integrate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very intimidated to speak after the inspiring keynote, especially with our keynote speaker chairing the session. So actually, I have to rethink the whole presentation that I'm going to give and rip up my presentation and start again. So actually, we need a bit of participation from the audience because I think some people start to nod off. So now is a bit of exercise time. So I just want to check a few things before I say a bit about greenhouse gases. Can I check who in the room does not want more peatland fires and haze? Who wants to be able to breathe some clean air? Oh, there's quite a few that want dirty air still, okay. Who does not want more floods and droughts? Some like to be flooded out, I think. Okay, and who wants more stronger typhoons and storms? Any volunteers? No, okay. Maybe the people making the storm shelters would be happy with that. Okay, who would like to see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and associated climate change? Okay, and who believes that the oil palm sector can and must work to address greenhouse gas emissions? Okay, I think we're doing quite well, but there's still a few unconverted people, or maybe you had too much for your coffee break. Now, if only I could see the presentation down here, I will give some inputs. So So I'm going to try and touch on three things. Why are greenhouse gas emissions important to RSPO? Well, I think all of you have indicated some interest in the room. What is RSPO doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and on HCS and deforestation? And what are RSPO views on the HCS study and HCS approach that we've heard just now? So, firstly, why are greenhouse gas emissions important to RSPO? Emissions of greenhouse gas lead to climate change, which has a major negative impact on the whole planet's ecosystem, as well as its human population, as well as all other species population. Climate change is related to extreme events which have severe negative impact on the oil palm sector. Oil palm sector has been identified as a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change in the past, and RSPO is committed to work towards reducing emissions in the greenhouse gas and oil palm sector. RSPO, all of you, adopted in the Principles and Criteria 2013 version, which includes a range of measures to reduce deforestation, conversion of peatlands, and greenhouse gas emissions. So I think we're all coming to understand that the clearance of forest and peatlands for plantation development leads to large-scale greenhouse gas emissions and haze. And many of you here can probably remember 97, 98, when we had a smoke cloud covering 10 million square kilometers in Southeast Asia for almost 6 months, which caused an economic loss of more than $10 billion, and that was mainly driven by large-scale clearance and burning of peatlands. That was one of the formative drives in and stimulus for the establishment of RSPO. Unfortunately, here we are 15 years later, and we're still being hit by smoke and haze coming from burning peatlands being opened up for oil palm. So we seem not to have learnt enough on what to do. But is the oil palm sector responding? I think yes, the answer is yes. And I will try to share with you a little about what RSPO is doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So RSPO is trying to take a comprehensive approach, and in a number of the key criteria in the new principles and criteria adopted last year are relevant to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Criteria 4.3 and 4.4, introduction of best management practices for water management in existing oil palm plantations on peat. Criterion 5.6, plans to reduce greenhouse gases are developed, implemented and monitored. Criterion 7.3, no conversion of high conservation value areas since November 2005. And remember, many high conservation value areas are forests significant for carbon storage and sequestration. Criteria 7.4, minimizing future development on peat, and for the rest of the world, group have set a default maximum of 100 hectares of plantation development on peat within the whole plantation block. Criteria 7.7, zero burning for all operations, no burning of the land in new plantation development. And last but not least, criteria 7.8, carbon stock assessment and plans to minimize net greenhouse gas emissions. And it's this last one that I will dwell on in a little more detail. Firstly, to mention the work already done, and that's the RSPO Manual on Best Management Practices for existing oil palm on peat, not a license for doing new development on peat. And these are highlighted as one of the key steps in the new PNC to be implemented. Some key measures which are there to minimize subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions. We need to maintain as much as possible the natural vegetation cover and keep the water as high as possible, at least in the early stage of the plantation. For mature plantation, water management is critical to optimal production of the plantation as well as reducing subsidence and emission. We have the RSPO Manual on Best Management Practice for management and rehabilitation of natural vegetation associated with oil palm cultivation on peat. There are set-aside areas, buffer zone areas, high conservation value areas, adjacent areas to plantations. And the way that we manage our plantations has a major impact on these areas. Very often, these are the areas that catch fire and burn, and some plantation managers say, "Hey, it's not me, it's outside my boundary, nothing to do with me." I'm sorry. Very often, it is to do with what happens in the plantation that adjacent areas degrade. The critical factor is what is the water level between the plantation and the adjacent lands. In here, this is the good practice that we promote, that the boundary between the plantation and the natural forest area, the water level must be kept as high as possible to maintain natural vegetation, prevent fires. This is a win-win for the plantation as well. This ensures good subsurface water supply to plantation, prevents the fire on adjacent land, and reduces the risk for the plantation itself. But when that's not followed, this is the type of result. Here we are, maybe 50 kilometers from where we're sitting today, this in 2012. So illegal clearing on the edge of a plantation area to plant more plantations in Selangor led to a fire which spread within days, covering hundreds of kilometers and destroying peat swamp forest. The key problem here, no proper water management on the boundary and no proper control of the activities. But all is not lost if you follow the guidance in the Best Management Practice Manual of RSPO. You block the water, you raise the water level, this is 18 months later. The forest can recover. People say these areas which are cleared and burnt on peat cannot recover. It's not true. It's been shown here in Malaysia, in Indonesia, many countries. We restore the right water level, we can bring back the forest cover, we can restore the peatland ecosystem. It is possible. So back to criteria 7.8. What exactly does it require plantation companies to do? Firstly, the carbon stock of proposed development areas, and 7.8 is about new plantings on new planting areas, so that the greenhouse gas emissions from new planting or new development should be minimized. And there are two specific indicators. Firstly, the carbon stock of the proposed development area and major potential sources of emissions that may result directly from the development shall be identified and estimated. So that's the assessment part. Secondly, there shall be a plan to minimize net greenhouse gas emissions, which takes into account avoidance of land areas with high carbon stocks and/or sequestration options. So what does that mean? There is a bit of guidance within the principles and criteria. So firstly, new developments covers the plantation, the mill operations, roads and other infrastructure. So it's quite broad. Secondly, growers are strongly encouraged to establish new plantings on mineral soils, low carbon stock areas and cultivated existing cultivation land. What is low carbon stock? This is, the other speakers were talking about what is high carbon stock. RSPO so far does the opposite. What is low carbon stock? This is specified in the principles and criteria as those areas with above and below ground carbon stores that would be lost by conversion to oil palm, smaller than that which would be sequestered within an oil palm crop and other set-aside areas within the management unit over the period of one rotation. I think, let's see whether anyone in the room can repeat that without the writing on the screen. It's a little complicated. This is what you get with long committee negotiation, but I will try to translate it. So basically, you need to look what is the stock sequestered in one cycle, 25 years of the oil palm plantation, which is somewhere between 55 to 60 tons above and below ground carbon within one 25-year cycle. It varies according to the clones that you're using and the length of the cycle and the situation. So in addition, what the wording says that if you have set aside conservation buffer zones, other areas, and those areas of forest grow and store carbon during the plantation cycle, you will get an extra top-up of that carbon stock. So maybe instead of 55, we're talking about 60 or 65 tons of carbon per hectare. And that's basically saying the low carbon stock are those areas which are similar to that 65-ton level. So that is the definition included and accepted by RSPO. RSPO does not yet define what is high carbon stock. So we're interested to see what is coming from the two studies. But conceptually, when we have discussed in the emission reduction working group of RSPO, we believe that we cannot say if it's not low carbon stock, it's automatically high. We feel that there needs to be some flexibility between a definition of low and a definition of high. If they're exactly together and the boundary is a straight line, then I think consultants in the room will be very happy. They'll be employed for the next 50 years measuring every kilogram of carbon on that land to see what is the interface and whether the land can or cannot be developed. So we're looking for a more pragmatic approach where we're looking for a banding and some flexible buffer between the low where the prioritized areas are and the high carbon stock which should be avoided. So within that flexibility, we give the companies the flexibility to choose the best strategy to minimize emissions. So in addition to the land-related changes, millers are encouraged to adopt low emission management practices with the concept that we give the flexibility to the company to see where is most cost effective, appropriate within the 25-year cycle to make some savings. So if you cannot save much on your land conversion, maybe you can have a production system that produces no pome, or you capture all the methane, or you turn the methane into electricity, and you do other offsets. So that flexibility in the RSPO scheme is given to the imagination and the future technology development that can come. So how do we do this measurement? There we have the RSPO greenhouse gas assessment procedure, which was called earlier the carbon assessment tool. This gives guidance on carbon stock assessment, assessment of emissions related to different development scenarios, balancing of the carbon stock, high conservation value and community assessments, and as well as the development requirements to come with an optimal scenario for development and development of a management and mitigation plan for the new development. So the guidelines, and I won't go into these details, will lead the growers through just a stepwise process for stratification of remote sensing to identify either through defaults or through ground assessments of the carbon stock of the different land areas in the new development. And similarly for the soils, identifying, we prioritize peat soils, identify the peat soils, and then we either through defaults or measurement determining the actual stock, and then we give formulas for calculating potential emissions from drainage. This will result in the production for the new development area of a carbon stock map. This is just a hypothetical example for different strata with different stocks. Then we combine that with the results from HCV assessment and community assessments to identify what may be the most suitable situation. We can look at the different development scenarios and the greenhouse gas uptake, which is below the green and the red below the line. Those are the sequestration, and the emissions which are above the line. And on that balance, you can see the right-hand one is actually net sequester, and the third from the left is the highest emitter, and that can be an input into the final decision. We're not saying you must always take the lowest emission option. You have to look at what is feasible, appropriate, having balanced other uses. Because the lowest carbon stock on the land, that may be the maize field of the local community. Do you want to wipe out the food of local community in the interest of having a low emission? No. So you need to balance these things together and come with an integrated approach. So emission management and mitigation plan needs to be developed. A simple stepwise approach, guidance is given on that. That will result in a summary report which will need to be submitted to RSPO at the same time as the new planting procedure submissions. So finally, what is the RSPO perspective on the HCS approach and HCS study? Firstly, RSPO welcomes initiatives by the industry to advance the understanding and implementation of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, we believe the proposed work is complementary to the requirements of the Principles and Criteria 2013 and the guidance issued so far by the Emission Reduction Working Group. Thirdly, we believe the assessment of biomass and soil carbon stocks by the two initiatives will help enrich our knowledge and understanding and enable development of regionally applicable defaults and guidance and enhanced assessment techniques. Lastly, we note that RSPO and several emission reduction working group members are also involved in some aspects of the other studies. So we hope there will be mutual sharing and engagement between the various studies, that over the next 2 years we will have a clear and better understanding. For RSPO, we're in a so-called implementation stage up until December 31st, 2016. During this time, all reporting by members comes only to the Secretariat and shared to the Emission Reduction Working Group on a strictly confidential basis. Growers are all encouraged to make it publicly available, but you're not required to do so. So after 1st of January 2017, it will be all public knowledge. So with that, I have one last question. Having listened to the presentation, who believes incorporating greenhouse gas emission reduction, this can easily be incorporated into the work of your own organizations? Everyone, put your hands up or no lunch. Okay, thank you very much.
First, I'll ask the panel members whether you have any comments on any of the either two. Grant?
That's on. Yeah, I just wanted to comment, I think, of the similarities, particularly when it comes to the integrative process of land use planning. So I think that's at least one thing that we're all talking about. And I think, yeah, the differences are really in what are the layers that are being considered here and what the direction is. So I think, you know, that's just something I think you might have all picked up on as well. And I think, you know, with our approach, we're very much focused on no deforestation and trying to deliver that, and emissions reductions and addressing greenhouse gases is a consequence of that, but we really are focused on delivering on no deforestation. That is the key thing we're looking for. And I think, you know, in the integrative elements that process, it's certainly what we found with the HCS approach, it's serving to strengthen the high conservation value assessment process, because we actually, in the process of doing the HCS assessments, we find weaknesses in the HCV approaches, for example, or actually there's elements of the HCS mapping that can be used for the HCV already. So we're seeing benefits, you know, to other aspects of the system already, and we're also looking at how the HCS approach can strengthen the rights aspects, the free, prior, informed consent process, and working through that. So looking how it can actually integrate and benefit in that way. So that's just an additional comment.
I see John shifting around. I don't know whether you want to have a response to that or...
Just following on from Grant, I think we are putting a much stronger emphasis on emissions, clearly, because we think that unless reliable estimates can be brought to the table, you can't have a good negotiation. And it's a tricky business to make a reliable estimate of greenhouse gas emissions as a result of land conversion, how that varies in space, and the ongoing management effects. It's quite a tricky business to get that in a cost-effective way. So we're very keen that we can bring to the negotiation reliable information. After that, it becomes, I think, a negotiation. The very high greenhouse emitting parts of the landscape are fairly obvious. Peatlands, drained peatlands, and the high biomass forest, I think they will clearly be non-go areas. But there's a lot of other forest which I think is potentially convertible, depending on the circumstances. Because remember that what Grant proposed is much easier to implement in already fragmented or disturbed landscapes. And we would all agree, I think, that if degraded land or cleared land is available and is suitable for oil palm, that it probably should be used. But there are other places where in intact forested landscapes, those options don't exist. And setting a very low threshold for carbon stock or emissions will effectively totally eliminate any opportunities for development in some countries and landscapes. And I think that is, a fairly unrealistic option. So we do need to have flexibility in terms of making a reliable greenhouse gas estimation as a consequence of development and bringing it to the table, but it is just one factor that goes into the discussion about land use planning and estate management planning.
Faisal, you went over your time anyway, but I'll give you a chance.
Okay, I'll be brief. 2 points I'd just like to pick up from the other analysis, which I think altogether, I think the three studies complement each other and are moving in the same direction. But there are two factors I want to highlight. One is the patch analysis approach within HCS. I think this is important because of the issue of the viability. If we're just only thinking of the carbon stock and we end up with small isolated islands of forest or vegetation which may not be viable, then I think we need to rethink that. The second one, I think, from the HCS study is the recognition that it's not only peat soils that have significant organic matter content. There are a range of other organic soils which do have significant stocks, and that may be need to look at in the context of the development area.
Well, I'm afraid I've got a million questions to ask, but I don't want to take over this. I'm going to open it to questions from the audience. There are sheets of paper that are available, and you're to turn that in to me, and thank you. We have only one. That's great, but I hope others will take advantage. Before I read this, let me just say, it's a good thing I'm not on this panel. I believe all deforestation should stop now, and it should have stopped years ago. I think the Brundtland Commission report did a very, very bad thing. They set a target of protecting 12% of the land and for conservation values. But that means 88% is going to be available for one species, us. This is absurd. We're one species out of maybe 30 million species, and we want to take over 88% of it. We don't even know how nature maintains its productivity and abundance. The last bits we have left are the only opportunity we're going to have to meet the challenge of our time, which is restoration of the forests on the bulk of the land areas of the planet. That's the big target. That's what we've got to go to. And to say, oh, well, you know, HCS, HVCV, and all these things are just a part. No, the big picture is we've got to stop all deforestation as quickly as possible and learn to live on much less. The challenge of our time is reforesting the planet. No. But I'm not on the panel. These are the experts. So I will shut up from here on in. And here's a question. It says, more efficient to impose AC threshold on CPO rather than on land to be developed, global and incentive, oh, I'm sorry, incentive good practices. I'm sorry, I'm sure the panelists understand this. Doesn't make any sense to me at all, but this is a very technical question. Do you understand what the question is? More efficient to impose AC threshold on CPO rather than on land to be developed. Global and incentive good practices. Prod good practices. Yes. Sorry. The printing is very good. I'm just a lousy reader. I'm sorry. Do you know what that?
Well, maybe I'll start off with one interpretation of that, and there'll be another one coming along. I mean, my understanding is that the question is, rather than using a threshold on the carbon stock on the land, that we set a global threshold of how much carbon emission per ton of CPO. And that theoretically would allow more flexibility to the companies about how they aggregate different land units and like get an average low level. I think the problem there is ultimately oil palm is developed on the land. It's not a virtual product which is created in a hypothetical area, and therefore you do need a tracking and guidance mechanism to look at what's on the land to aggregate back. And I think setting some sort of threshold, but I think none of us are proposing specific numerical threshold, but threshold in terms of types of land that can be developed is the one that can be implementable, practical, monitored, and so on. Whereas if you start just saying hypothetically, by mixing these various sources, one from the grassland and one from the forest, we can get to a low average. I mean, it can be a way of totally losing control.
John?
Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion to express emissions per unit of product, per tonne of oil, for example, because it is possible to get a more efficient outcome that way. Lesser land, higher yield. It might be more emissions per unit of land, but less emission per unit of product. So that's certainly worth thinking about, and one that we'll take into account in our study.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just a brief comment that deforestation happens in a place, and so you have to deal with that, and just dealing with the emissions from the oil will not stop deforestation like that.
Okay, the next question is one that I kind of wanted to ask too. If companies are protecting HCS forests within their concession in order to offset emissions from conversion under 7.8, how do you ensure that the HCS is protected legally over the 30-year period, i.e. Not claimed by government? Anyone want to answer that?
I think it's a major practical issue in Indonesia, where there are challenges, or plantation companies regularly report challenges to maintain high carbon stock areas within their developments. Although we understand in Indonesia also there is such a range of laws that what may not be possible under one law is possible under another. But I think this is something very clearly that needs to be looked at, and a way found to provide permanence to these areas, whether they're within or outside the boundary of concession areas. There has to be a way to ensure permanence, and permanence should be forever, I guess, and at minimum something of 100 years or more, until we can transition this planet into a better way of thinking, of managing it.
Yeah, just to add that certainly the companies who are implementing the HCS approach are telling us this is the biggest challenge they have, is you can identify these areas, and then if the legal framework is not supporting the conservation, then it's very problematic. And so Indonesia in particular, it's problematic, but everywhere this is a problem. So I think this leads to the engagement with governments and really getting their support for these approaches. And I guess just to also say that the conservation and protection of these areas is not just about government, it's about governance of these lands, which really involves the community and the people who have the long-term stewardship of those lands. And so the protection mechanisms and how you go about that has to be negotiated with the community and get their support for it as well.
I might add that I just come off a 7-week bus tour from the east coast of Canada across to the west coast. And the reason is that when a new government comes in, they always act as if the old government were so stupid nothing they did is worth anything, and they toss it out. Our current government now has been in power for 8 years, and they've thrown out everything and undermined decades of environmental legislation, undermined it overnight by getting them passed and rejected. So I've been on a tour trying to get the enshrinement of a right to a healthy environment, clean air, clean water, clean food, in our Constitution, so that it can't just be overthrown by the whim of the latest government. Anyway, that's just another aside. This is a question to the panel or any grower. So while we argue on HCS or HCV, the growers keep clearing, and how does this affect the compensation and remediation process of clear now and pay later concept because of non-clarity of HCV and HCS? Anyone want to tackle that? Go ahead, Faisal.
I think that it is very critical to put in place clear, understandable rules that can be implemented. And I think the problem that has been faced, the lesson of RSPO, was that when introduced the high HCV in 2005, it was not very clear, strong rules and guidance given to everyone, although those obviously who were deciding on it were aware of what it meant. That was not really put in place and policed adequately at the beginning. And I think we don't want to make the same mistake with greenhouse gas and others, and that's why we need very rapid action and then rapid checking and monitoring and feedback, so we don't get a repeat of the clear now and pay later problem that we had with high conservation value.
John?
I think globally there's issues around certification schemes and codes of practice and all sorts of related environmental protection mechanisms. They typically tend to be input driven. In other words, there are a set of rules, and then the first thing to do is to see, well, is there compliance with the rules? Okay, that's the first step. Takes a bit of work, sometimes not done, but it's a fundamental first step. But a much more critical step is to ask the question, well, did following the rules actually get you where you wanted to be? In other words, are these things working? So is HCV actually working? Is Rspo certification actually helping? Can we answer those questions? Because if we can't, it needs a fundamental reinvestment of resources into providing the information to answer those questions.
So here's a question for Grant or John. When will the HCS approach or study be ready?
Well, the study will be ready within 1 year. We've committed to that. We'll do the best we can within that time frame. It doesn't mean that all the questions will be answered. There may be other things to address in subsequent work, but we felt we had to do that because time's moving, and we didn't want to be accused of delaying tactics. So we want to have clear recommendations within 12 months.
So here's a related question that comes to you. The Rspo GHGWG collected a lot of reliable data on emissions from above and below ground. Do we need more data or action on the data we have?
I'll just answer the first one as well, David. The HCS approach that we have is operating now. It's practical and it's working now with a number of companies. So while we're doing ongoing science and trials and even experimentation as well to improve it, it's operational now, so it can be immediately implemented. And yeah, of course, I think there is greenhouse gas emission data, but I think when we started to try and make a practical approach for it, it really didn't really relate very well to what was on the ground. So when we took carbon maps, for example, for some of the areas that we're working, and then we went and looked at the ground and did field plots, they didn't match up. There was less than 50% correlation, so we had to do something more. So that's part of the background to actually creating this approach.
Just a quick comment. I think we shouldn't be striving for perfection here because it's a very complicated area and you can put a lot of resources into trying to get a perfect number. It's much more important to get something that's fairly reliable and that can really influence things on the ground. But on the other hand, it's critical to bring the best science to this. There are lots of holes in what's currently being proposed. Particularly, uncertainties are often totally ignored in this discussion, and they can't be. So that's an issue that we'll be addressing in our science study. What is the uncertainty of the estimates that are being made, and how does this influence your decision making?
Question for Faisal. GHG emissions are also linked to subsidence. What does this mean in the longer term for the 20% of oil that exists on peat, the oil
palm, yeah.
Palm.
Okay. Subsidence is a major issue with peat. Once you open up the land surface, you drain it, you are guaranteed that the land will subside as it compacts and then oxidizes. So the implication for all of the oil palm, and there's 2.4 million hectares at least on peat already, those are going to start subsiding. Where if the water table is kept as high as possible, it will be a slower rate of subsidence. If it's lower, a faster rate of subsidence. And within probably, depending on the land area and location, between 1 to 2 cycles, the land will come to a situation where it's impossible to gravity drain, and you're ended up with a flooded swamp area which cannot be used for other things. So this is a very serious issue. Rspo has put in the P&C a clear requirement to do a drainability study before anyone can replant on peat, and if they cannot ensure for the coming 40 years there will not be this flooding problem, then they need to get out of oil palm and look at other alternate crop species. So there are mechanisms. Is it being implemented? We have yet to see.
So this is to all the panel. How can we simplify the debate on HCV, HCS to make it effective on the ground without, of course, losing the value of the content? Okay, Grant?
Yeah, happy to comment on that. as part of the high carbon stock approach steering group, we have agreed on establishing a working group process to look at how we integrate and really deal with those issues of where there's overlapping aspects of the methodologies, and to come with one streamlined approach really to make it much simpler for communities in particular, but also make it more cost effective for the companies who are implementing it. And that is currently being led by Proforest and with other parties in the steering group contributing. So we'd welcome, I guess, some technical input onto that from anyone who is working in those fields.
It's a critical integration. I think it will be very much helped by clarity around the concepts. What is HCV trying to do? What is additional biodiversity protection activities like the HCS steering group trying to do? And what is HCS actually about? If it's about emissions, and that's clarified, this makes the whole integration much easier. At the moment, with the risk of being unkind, they're often foggy concepts that are trying to be integrated, and that's very difficult.
Okay, question to Grant and others. What do you see as a future for applying HCS in high forest landscapes? Does HCS mean zero development?
Yeah, the development of the HCS approach was in areas that were varying degrees of degradation. So disturbed landscapes with some patches of forest and some more open areas. So that's very much where it's come from. But certainly in the broader application of the approach, we are trialling it in different places, including in Liberia and Papua New Guinea, where there is higher forest cover. And so some of the patch analysis, for example, doesn't quite work because you've more or less just got one very big patch. So I think we are looking to develop additional tools to see how we can come to an approach, an equitable approach in those sorts of high forest cover situations. But I think as David says, maybe we really need to think about whether these intact forest areas should be cleared for industrial development. Are we at that stage in the planet where we exceeded our planetary boundaries so much that we really need to think about that question, and whether think about the values that are in those forests, and does our economic system actually value those forests as they are and as they are standing? So I think there's a lot to consider in the decisions now for that, and there is major equity issues, I think, as well we have to be very conscious of. Thank you.
I think Grant raises a lot of good points. I agree with them. But we have to be realistic. If we set the threshold very low, it effectively means no development in many places.
I'm always struck by that thing about we have to be realistic. I've been told that so many times by politicians and business people. Listen, Suzuki, that's all well and good what you say, but we have to be realistic. The economy is the bottom line. So I get a bit of a shudder when I hear that expression, we have to be realistic.
We could take the realistic out of it, but if you do set the threshold low,
okay,
there will be no development.
That's right. Here's for Dr. Raisin. Is Central Africa included in the study?
Yes.
Is there no more to say? Because this has got more question on it, but it says, should countries who manage their forests in a responsible way in the past and still are forested over 80% and put in place a national land use plan be penalized by the setting of thresholds?
Yeah, I think we covered that already. It's the problem of dealing with regional variation, and it's a difficult issue, biodiversity. I'm no expert, but the question always asked is how much is enough? And if you take a global view that we need to retain all remaining forests, then that's the answer. But of course, regionally, there are many other drivers for deforestation and development, and and so on that we need to be aware of.
Maybe I can add to this. I think one of our problems is how we define development. If you can only have development means you have to clear all your natural resources and wipe out the landscape and start again, that some people may define that as development, others may define that as destruction. I think we have to look really at new paradigms of how we're developing. I mean, we have a whole industry which is built around one species of plant from one forest from West Africa, and we're relying on it for covering vast landscapes, and we're replacing another extremely diverse landscape of forests which may have many other equally valuable or more valuable products. And how much investment is being put in to find the next valuable products out there? Little or no money is being invested in that. And we may find, I mean, we're seeing now the decline of the oil palm price rapidly in the last few years. We should be looking at what is the next product or what are alternative products that we can develop, and can we have products which do not involve the whole-scale removal of a natural ecosystem which has many functions and values. I think that is the paradigm shift that we have to go, and I think and I hope that Rspo, even though it is about oil palm, would be thinking beyond oil palm and looking at new ways forward, and that in 10 years' time when we're coming back, we're talking about totally different models of development which have been put forward within this frame.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a small addition. I agree with Faisal there. And this issue is obviously very difficult, and there is equity issues between different countries, I guess, or different regions. And certainly it's one of the issues that the HCS Approach Steering Group has started a discussion on, but there's a lot to go with that. And so we are also setting up a sort of a working group process to try and take that discussion a lot further as well, and we'd welcome people getting involved in that.
In my many discussions with the fossil fuel industry, I keep telling them, you are energy companies. You're not oil companies, you're energy companies. And where is the get up and go on entrepreneurialism in terms of looking for where the next energy future is? Instead, they just want to keep drilling down and pumping the stuff out. And what you just said, Faisal, I think is very, very true. And there is a story that I have told to my children as they were growing up about the goose that laid the golden egg. And in that children's story, as long as the goose was fat and healthy, everyone got to collect a golden egg every day. But if you get greedy and kill the goose trying to get them all at once, guess what? There's nothing left. And we too often aren't seeing what the goose is. The goose is the intact forest. The goose is the biosphere that gives us clean air, clean water, clean soil. And as long as those things are happy and healthy, we can make livings. But if we keep putting our interest above the very health of the goose, then we're going to lose out every time. Here's one for Faisal. It's encouraging to have good policy level decision on HCS and Rspo, but how is implementing this in the grassroots level? How is this being implemented at the grassroots level to increase the staff and policy executors' awareness on this?
I think it's an area where Rspo, through its members, to its members, and beyond its members, has to do more. I think even some of the concepts I've presented today, although we adopted them more than a year ago in April 2013, I think many growers, many here today, are not familiar with the details, are not understanding what you have to do now and what you will have to do by January 1st next year to implement the thing. So if people in this room do not understand that, how about the people down at the ground level, down through the operations, the workers, those developing new plantations, those managing plantations, and then how about the other stakeholders, the local government, the central government? And I think this is where Rspo does need to put much more effort and resources to outreach and communicate clearly and effectively to those key target audiences and bring them along with Rspo on the way forward. Although Rspo members do control, as it said, 50–60% of the global trade, but still that 40% of the production, particularly in smallholder and other medium and smallholder lands, are going to have a major impact on land use change. And we have to reach out and we have to bring them together, and that has to be work in partnership with the governments.
Okay, Grant. Actually, it's now 6 o'clock. Did someone increase my time here? Yes. Oh. They Okay. It says, who is going to develop the master plan for Papua that saves some of the forest but also brings local development? From Japan, Oxfam.
Yeah, I think this is the same question again, really, in these places where there is high forest cover and there are very difficult equity and socioeconomic issues, and I guess we haven't found the full solution for that. The approach we're working with is working well in some places and it's challenging in others. So I think this is part of the ongoing work that we're working towards, and I think this is some of the collaboration that we might be able to have with the study here as well. So in the end, we are just, one or, some of the stakeholders that are part of the overall planning process that goes on in these places. So I think this is a point to make as well.
This one was just handed to me. Do you know who that is? Oh, it must be John. Why is Latin America out of your study?
I think the simple answer is that we've got enough on our plate already for 1 year, so we've decided that it's not realistic to go into Latin America. Not to say that work doesn't need to be done there, of course it does.
This is for all three of you. If we, the oil palm community, try hard to reduce emissions from our activity, how about a big country, the big countries, who do not even want to sign the Kyoto Convention? Because they want to protect their industries. In creating HCS, it has to be based on science, which I do not see the basic science of creating HCS in years. I think that's an additional question there. But if that question is directed to me, I think it's absolutely right for Canada. And I heard this on the news this morning, a Canadian saying, oh, we only produce 2% of the emissions in the world. Yeah, but wait a minute, we're only 0.4% of the world's population, and you're claiming, oh, we only produce a small amount? I was at Kyoto in 1997. So were China, so were India. And the Canadians were there trying to muck it up, as we always are. When the agreement came out, all of the industrialized countries agreed we had created the problem. And therefore, we allow the developing world to continue to increase their emissions so that they can increase economic activity, while we in the industrialized countries cap emissions and bring them down. As soon as Kyoto was over, Canada immediately said, oh, well, we can't do that. India and China aren't even on the agreement. Why should we do it? And my position was, we created the problem. If we can't even cap our emissions and bring ours down, why should any developing country pay any attention to us? We had to set the example. And it's humiliating for me as a Canadian to be here. We're the only country that ratified Kyoto. I was very proud of that, but then pulled out at the last minute.
Yeah, I'm from New Zealand, and it's more or less a similar situation as well in terms of the lack of ambition and commitment to emissions reductions. It's just embarrassing. But I think just to make a point on the science behind the HCS approach, we've had science input all the way along. We've had science reviews on the different phases, and so that will be clear in the toolkit that comes out. But so we have an ambition to base it on the best science we can find.
Go ahead.
I think it's short-sighted to think, why do we have to do something when someone else is not doing something? We have to think what is good for us and is good for the planet. We all have to invest in that. If there's some short-sighted people from Canada or elsewhere who don't know the right thing to do, then leave them behind, but don't let us forget what we're trying to do. And I think RSPO members have rarely gone beyond the curve on so many things in the past. They have moved, they have taken global leadership that has been recognized by many in many areas, and I think we have seen the benefits of that to the members. Although in the beginning people were thinking only price premium or other things, when we implemented all of the RSPO principles and criteria, people were finding more efficiency, less wastage, better production, more streamlined operations. There were many other benefits. And I think we will find as we go into looking at greenhouse gas emissions as well, although people see it a barrier at the beginning, you will see the benefits which come from it later. That's what we have to look at. But in terms of the equitable sharing of the burden, it should not only be the growers. It must be the manufacturers, the retailers, and all of the others in the supply chain that share the burden. So let's call on all of them to contribute towards the efforts by the sector. And we've talked in the past, but it's never happened, create an internal trading mechanism within RSPO where the growers are setting aside area, are conserving areas, are adjusting their practices, and the rest of the supply chain are contributing, are buying credits, are contributing resources. Let's have Unilever, who is one of the world's biggest companies, contribute its resources to help this key sector and invest. And let's have the other buyers, the supermarkets and others from Europe, contribute directly towards this and back up the growers when they're really making an effort to make a difference.
So, gee, Faisal, you're getting all the attention here. How will the RSPO simplify these GHG emissions and HCS calculations for smallholders?
Okay, this is definitely one of the challenges, and I think for smallholders, RSPO is not certifying as individuals, but as group collectives. And so there has to be relatively easy mechanisms for those, but I think yesterday in the plenary we had a good example. We had the village cooperative from Riau that said we are developing 700 hectares of oil palm. We also have a 500 hectare village forest, community forest area. That is actually a very good example of that sort of partnership that could be linked together through this mechanism. Not that we say the villagers should do it all on their own, but in partnership with the other bigger companies, maybe they can achieve it. And what we have seen on the ground in Indonesia and elsewhere, actually villagers can do a hell of a lot better than the government in looking after resources, in maintaining and restoring things. If you look at the government-managed conservation areas, they're all logged to hell. The village protection area is much better protected. So don't think it's too difficult for smallholders, but we must empower them and we must support them properly, and that's what RSPO must do.
Well, I think we've gone on quite long, and I'm going to take an executive decision and say thank you very much. I really want to congratulate RSPO for putting on this panel discussion, but as well for engaging in a serious conversation about the issues like climate change. I come from a country where climate change is whispered down the halls. We don't openly discuss it as something that's established. I congratulate you for being so much further along than some of countries like Australia and Canada. And thank you, panel, very much for participating in this enlightening discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suzuki, and a wonderful panelist. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this morning's program. We will now stop for lunch and we'll resume at 2 p.m.